Dokładnie
17 days after Vladimir Putin's speech at Westerplatte, in which this politician tried to build a new architect of Europe on a historical lie, Polish President Lech Kaczynski raised this concept from Lisbon to Vladivostok to the ground here in Warsaw. He did so at the monument to the murdered of the East, on the 70th anniversary of Russian aggression against Poland.
Pomniku pomordowanym na wschodzie w 70. rocznicę rosyjskiej agresji na Polskę.
70 lat temu, dokładnie 70 lat temu, Polska otrzymała cios w plecy. Armia polska...
The Polish army fought in Warsaw, Modlin, on Hel, in the Lwów region, in the Lublin region, and in many other places in our country.
I w wielu innych miejscach naszego kraju trwa jeszcze bitwa pod
The Battle of Kutno was still in progress. That day, at about 2 a.m., the Soviet army, with more than 600,000 men, broke through the borders of the Republic of Poland and committed an act of aggression. Our army resisted the Soviet aggressor in more than one place.
Wielu z nich, w szczególności wielu oficerów, dostało się do niewoli. Decyzją z 5 marca.
Soldiers are there to defend the fatherland. Many of them, especially many officers, were captured. By the decision of March the 5th, 1940, which was formally a decision of the Politburo, but in reality a decision of Stalin, they were murdered.
Jeżeli tego rodzaju akt
If such an act, which according to this decision affected 30,000 people, is not genocide, then I wonder what is.
To się pytam, co nim jest.
I ask myself this question, has been asked in Poland, and not just by anyone. Russian diplomats feared that Polish President Lech Kaczynski, in line with his repeated statements, would consistently refer to these crimes as genocide. That he would say the same on the 70th anniversary of this Katyn crime. That he would say so on the 70th anniversary of this Katyn crime, that the Russians feared that a Russian president or a Russian prime minister would have to listen to this, and that this would ruin the geopolitical plans of the Russian Federation. Celebrations of the 70th anniversary of the murder of Polish officers in Katyn. The ambassador also expressed interest in the preparations for this anniversary and the participation of the President of the Republic of Poland in it. He noted that the Russian side has not yet decided on the participation of a representative of the authorities of the Russian Federation. I explained that although President Kaczynski had already been to Katyn once in 2007, it was not impossible that he would have to travel there again. I pointed out the significance of the anniversary for many Polish families and the need to honour them properly. While talks were taking place in Moscow between the Russian and the Polish foreign ministries, the presidential chancellery in Warsaw informed the Russian embassy that the president would be in Katyn on April the 10th. The Chancellery sent a letter to Ambassador Grinin, and on February the 2nd, during a reception for the diplomatic corps at the presidential palace, Minister Handlik personally informed Ambassador Grinin as well.
Tego samego dnia,
On the same day, February the 2nd, during an official meeting, Andrzej Przewodnik, the organizer of the entire ceremony, informed the participants who were preparing for these ceremonies that he had received official confirmation from both the President and the Prime Minister that both the President and the Prime Minister intended to be in Katyn on April the 10th, 2010.
10 kwietnia 2010 roku. Dzień później.
A day later, the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, calls Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. We publish for the first time a recording of this telephone conversation.
Po raz pierwszy.
Vladimir Putin personally, officially invited the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland to jointly participate in the commemoration ceremony in honour of the fallen. I believe that our joint participation will have a very important symbolic dimension. He added that, in his opinion, the commemorations should acquire a moral and ethical character. The main purpose of this conversation was that Prime Minister Putin invited Prime Minister Donald Tusk to jointly mark the anniversary of the Katyn tragedy. Prime Minister Putin and I wanted to quote this to you verbatim, addressed the Prime Minister in this way. I believe that our joint participation in these celebrations would have a very important symbolic dimension.
Miałby bardzo ważny wymiar symboliczny.
The technical details were agreed in a telephone conversation a day later. Tomasz Arabski spoke with Yuri Ushakov, deputy head of Vladimir Putin's government. At the conversation on February the 4th this year, Ushakov proposed a date for a meeting in Katyn at the request of the Russian side and with reference to the Prime Minister's conversation of February the 3rd. The proposal of the Russian side was April the 6th. In response, Arabski pointed out that on that day the Council of Ministers was meeting and therefore it might be difficult to accept the date. On the other hand, he reported that the Polish side was considering April the 10th as Saturday after mutual preferences had been set for an April 9th or 11th date. Ushakov suggested April 7th, a Wednesday.
Data 7 kwietnia jako...
For the first time, April the 7th appears as the date of these very Polish-Russian celebrations commemorating the Katyn massacre in a conversation between a very important advisor, as the documents say, the head of the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin's apparatus, Ushakov, and the head of Prime Minister Donald Tusk's chancellery, namely Tomasz Arabski. In a telephone conversation between these two gentlemen, Ushakov and Arabski, the Russian side, i.e. Ushakov, suggests April the 7th as the date for these celebrations with the participation of Tusk and Putin. And only in this context, Putin's call can be fully understood.
Telefon Putina może być w pełni zrozumiały.
To w tym momencie
That was the moment when they were separated, finally sealed. Yes, exactly.
To jest moment, kiedy zostało to przypieczętowane.
This is the moment when it was sealed, because from this moment it is known that on April the 7th, Tusk and Vladimir Putin will be in Katyn. On the other hand, it can be said that President Lech Kaczynski and his agenda were finally orphaned at this moment.
Ostatecznie została osierocona.
wiele lat później.
Many years later, Tomasz Arabski, who was eventually convicted in the Smolensk trial, testified in court that the separation of visits never took place. A joint trip to Katyn was never organised. Consequently, the so-called separation of visits never took place. The so-called joint trip to Katyn was never organised. Consequently, the so-called separation of visits never took place. Sometime later, Donald Tusk made similar remarks in this same place. The term separation of visits was a journalistic or political term and served to specifically discredit me in my office.
Mnie i mojego urzędu.
On March the 17th, 2010, Tomasz Arabski, head of Prime Minister Tusk's office, flies to Moscow. His itinerary includes, among other things, a meeting with Yuri Ushakov, a meeting of confidants of the then Prime Ministers of Poland and Russia, which takes place in a bizarre place, the Dorian Gray restaurant in Moscow. It is not the first time that the participants of this meeting see each other in such informal circumstances. From my point of view, it was important that Minister Arabski agreed with his counterparts about the talks in Smolensk. The problem was, and I expected this from Minister Arabski, that the Russians know that on the occasion or on the day when we honour the victims of Katyn, we will not talk about detailed Russian or Polish proposals in terms of economy, energy and so on. In the documents in the archive of the Prime Minister's office, there is hardly a sentence about the content of the conversation between Ushakov and Arabski. The official document speaks in much more detail about the second part of the meeting, which took place in the same place at the same time. It is a meeting between Tomasz Arabski and Igor Sechin, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister responsible for gas and energy issues. Igor Sechin suggested signing a declaration in Smolensk in the presence of the prime ministers of both countries, possibly an agreement on economic cooperation, especially in the field of energy. I expressed my surprise and doubts that such documents could be signed at this time in the framework of Katyn celebrations. Sechin stated that the Russian Federation proposes cooperation based on the principle of mutual benefit in the following areas: 1. Nuclear energy, 2. Oil, and 3. Gas.
7 kwietnia 2010 roku Donald Tusk
and Vladimir Putin arrive at Smolensk Severny Airport on April the 7th, 2010. The celebrations begin in the Russian part of the ceremony with the laying of the foundation stone for a new Orthodox church in this part of the necropolis. In the next part of the ceremony, the prime ministers reach the Polish part of the cemetery. There they give speeches. With cynical lies, they have tried for decades to hide the truth about the Katyn executions. But it would be the same lie that the blame should be put on the Russian people. In his speech, Putin presents Katyn as a crime whose victims are the two nations of Poland and Russia. And then he mentions other places, other crimes, other victims of the totalitarian regime. Only then the Polish Prime Minister takes the floor.
Dopiero potem przemawia polski premier.
Mr. Prime Minister, the victims are here. They are lying in this ground. The eye sockets of their bullet-riddled skulls are watching and waiting. Are we able to turn violence and lies into reconciliation?
Przemoc i kłamstwo zamienić w pojednanie.
The best summary of the April 7th, 2010 commemorations with Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Putin is one of several options I read in one of the Polish intelligence reports on the April 7th events.
Przeczytałem w jednym z raportów polskich służb specjalnych na temat.
The general point is that the Polish Katyn, in quotation marks, became part of the Great Katyn, whose main victims, as Vladimir Putin himself said on April the 7th, 2010, were Soviet citizens.
Byli, jak powiedział sam Władimir Putin 7 kwietnia 2010 roku.
And this reflection, I must admit here, is sad, but it is true. And I share this consideration with the Polish Special Services.
Jest smutna, ale jest prawdziwa i ja tą refleksję polskich służb specjalnych podzielam.
The black box of the crashed plane. Oh, F. That was our plane.
Kiedy w Smoleńsku
While the dramatic scenes in Smolensk were unfolding, the staff of the State Department's Operations Center was trying to gather information about what was happening in Russia.
informacje na temat tego, co wydarzyło się w Rosji.
Yes, I'm all ears. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. The MFA Operations Center is on the line. Do we know anything more at the moment? Well, at the moment I'm standing here. The plane is completely destroyed. And is it certain that it is our plane? But of course, it's our plane. Excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, I have the minister on the line. Operations Center? Sikorski. Yes, Mr. Minister. Is there any new information? I'm already giving word to a colleague who has the ambassador on the line. One moment, please. Mr. Minister, I have the ambassador on the line. Can I switch from the other phone? Yes, please. We're going to hang up now and I'll call you right back. Hello? Operations Center? Mr. Secretary, we have a list of the passengers who are on board. How can I make the list available to you? Please email them to me and please send me who else was there. Kaczynski, Kaczorowski, and of course the President's wife, Kaczorowski Richard. The list of these passengers is very long when I read these names. It's difficult for me to pick out the important now. There are 89 names. Yes, sure, please send it to me. Mr. Minister, but I have a problem. At the moment, the repair is in progress. Emails do not work. Damn. We are cut off from the power supply. Complications due to this weather disaster. By fax? Fax works, and I can also fax to the number provided. Okay, in a minute. I'll call you right back because I need to activate the fax machine. Excuse me, please, I have one more question. Has the minister already spoken to the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister knows it. The President of the Sejm knows it. And I personally informed Jarosław Kaczynski.
Pierwsi zadzwonili z kondolencjami premier Putin.
The first to express their condolences were Prime Minister Putin and President Medvedev. I am in constant contact with the minister, officials and Russian authorities. I will travel to Smolensk shortly.
Udam się do Smoleńska.
Polish prosecutors are already on the ground.
Prokuratorzy.
To właśnie w tym momencie
At this point, Vladimir Putin and other top representatives of the Russian power and intelligence system demonstrated for the first time to the members of Donald Tusk's government gathered on the scene what the official Russian mendacious version of events in this case would be.
wersja wydarzeń w tej sprawie. Zgodnie z nią,
According to it, Polish pilots were to be blamed for Russian actions that led to the deaths of 96 Polish citizens, headed by the President of the Republic.
odpowiadać mieli polscy piloci. Donald
Tusk embraced this view.
przyjął jako własny. Od 13 do
From April the 13th to the 17th, 2010, more than 100,000 people visited the presidential palace.
odwiedziło Pałac Prezydencki. Ci, którzy
Those who came here on those days wanted to honor President Lech Kaczynski and his wife Maria, who died on April the 10th, 2010 on the flight to Katyn.
którzy 10 kwietnia 2010 roku zginęli, lecąc do Katynia. Uroczystości pogrzebowe
The funeral ceremonies began in Warsaw on April the 17th. The coffins of the presidential couple rode on gun carts through the capital. Hundreds of thousands of Poles on the streets of Warsaw and millions in front of television sets bid farewell to the president and his wife.
Polaków na ulicach Warszawy i miliony przed telewizorami.
Poles bid farewell to the presidential couple with flowers, applause and full concentration.
W pełnym skupieniu. Wojskowym samolotem Kasa.
In a Kasa military plane, the presidential couple flew from Warsaw to Krakow to Wawel.
Krakowa na Wawel. Pogrzeb był
The funeral ceremony was a major event in international politics. At the same time, a volcanic eruption in Iceland paralyzed most air traffic over northern Europe.
Światowe media prześcigały się.
The world media outdid themselves when they presented a list of absences in Krakow. The US President Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, and Nicolas Sarkozy did not come. The presidential couple's funeral was attended by representatives of the countries most interested in Poland's geopolitical future. Dmitry Medvedev arrived in Krakow, as did the German president and Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili, who rushed to Poland at a rapid pace. Polish authorities, however, the arrival of Russian President Dmitry Medvedev is of crucial importance. This is evident from the records kept in the Polish archives of the trilateral talks that have just taken place in Wawel Castle. These were trilateral talks between Komorowski, Medvedev and Donald Tusk. According to the Polish Foreign Ministry, the main conclusion of these talks was that the events of April 10, 2010 in Smolensk should serve to bring Poland and Russia closer together.
Ma zbliżyć Polskę i Rosję.
The meeting confirmed that both sides expect a significant improvement in Polish-Russian relations as a result of the recent tragic events related to Katyn and Smolensk. The personal involvement of President Dmitry Medvedev in the process of disclosure of the remaining Kaczynski files would certainly be conducive to this.
Charakterystyczną cechą
A characteristic feature of Soviet politics, Russian politics, is diligence, because to use a situation politically, you have to put it in its whole context.
To jest osadzenie jej w całym kontekście.
A very active, I would say, or perhaps differently activated Russian policy at that time. I'm thinking of both the policy of the President, the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, the open and behind-the-scenes policy of Russian diplomacy, and of course the activities of the secret services.
Rosyjskiej dyplomacji i oczywiście również o działaniach służb specjalnych.
The meeting between Tusk, Komorowski and Medvedev was a shocking concept. During the funeral of the Polish president, who died under unexplained circumstances in Russia, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and acting Sejm President Bronisław Komorowski proposed a further opening of relations with Russia in the last 2 years. This time, they are relying on the symbolism of protecting memorials to the Soviet army in Poland, an army that brought Poland decades of enslavement.
Która Polsce przyniosła zniewolenie trwające kilkadziesiąt lat.
Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced that in connection with the Russian celebrations of the 65th anniversary of the end of World War II on May 10, 2010, the Polish side would take measures to pay special attention to the cemeteries of Soviet soldiers.
To jest szokujące, bo tak, to zostało przedstawione.
This is shocking, because it was presented so these cemeteries of Russian, Soviet soldiers would be in a deplorable condition.
O te cmentarze, tak jakby one były.
The commemoration of the Red Army soldiers in Poland after April 10th.
Żołnierzom Armii Czerwonej.
All this was presented as a grassroots social act of gratitude to the Russians. On the other hand, the document I hold in my hands shows that this was an action coordinated by the Polish state.
Trzymam w ręku, wynika, że to była operacja zaordynowana przez państwo polskie. On April the 21st, 2010, the Internal Security Agency, Poland's largest counterintelligence service, sent an opinion to the military prosecutor's office. The existence of this opinion had been known to Smolensk investigators for years. However, the contents of the opinion were never published in detail, until now. The content includes a description of what can be seen and heard on the videos. The document from the Internal Security Agency analyzes several videos provided by the prosecutor's office, including 3 different versions of the Minute 24 video, which is believed to have been downloaded from YouTube, where this video appeared several hours after the incident. The Internal Security Agency points to 4 gunshot-like sounds. Even the prosecutor in charge of the investigation, who asked another investigative agency to identify and interpret the sounds heard on the recording, uses the phrase "sounds resembling gunshots" here. On December the 15th, 2010, the Central Forensic Laboratory of the police headquarters submitted its opinion on the matter. The content of this expert report is prepared differently, but the main conclusions are very similar. The police analyst writes the following about the sounds heard on the recording. Moreover, in the recording, in the video file entitled Smolensk Murder, 10th of April 2010, a high-quality film, 4 times, sounds reminiscent of gunshot and explosions can be heard. Interpretation of these sounds is beyond the competence of those who make this statement. After combining and overlaying the information developed by the Internal Security Agency and the Central Forensic Laboratory of the police headquarters with the Minute 24 video, and after overlaying a spectrogram graphically representing the audible sounds and recordings, the following picture emerges.
Нихуя себе!
Отец, полицию! Понял?
Нихуя себе!
Before Bronisław Komorowski became president, he was head of state for a few weeks. In this capacity, he also made his first trip abroad. It was a trip to Moscow. The occasion was May the 9th, a day designated in Soviet and post-Soviet Russian tradition as Victory Day. It was Bronisław Komorowski's visit to Moscow that provides the first direct evidence that the policy of restoring relations with Russia pursued by Donald Tusk's government since 2010 2007 was a policy fully accepted and supported by the highest circles of the German government. This is evident from a document preserved in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which records a conversation between Angela Merkel and Bronisław Komorowski on the occasion of their visit to Moscow on May 9, 2010.
9 maja 2010 roku.
We actually have a report about this meeting. It is not very long, but nevertheless, it is very symbolic and important. Here is the ciphertext. You have to be especially sensitive when dealing with neighbors. To us, it sounded like an encouragement to empathize with the Russians. A very high assessment of the behavior of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland after the disaster of April the 10th. A reminder that Donald Tusk will receive the Charlemagne Prize. The good cooperation with Russians in the investigation after April the 10th disaster and the cautious optimism about the progress of the Katyn investigation. This is an extremely important, perhaps brief, but extremely significant message that the public is really hearing about for the first time a month after Smolensk. Angela Merkel says in Moscow that Donald Tusk will be awarded the highest German order because she appreciates his policy towards Russia and refers to Donald Tusk's behavior after April the 10th, 2010. How is this to be understood? I think she has appreciated the pro-Russian policy of Donald Tusk from the very beginning, since the fall of 2007. But the most important thing in the context that we are talking about now is to emphasize that this pro-Russian policy of Donald Tusk under extreme conditions, and the extreme condition was April the 10th, 2010. From the German point of view, of course, from the point of view of Chancellor Merkel, he behaved the way Berlin would have expected him to behave. That is, he did not go down the road of reset with Russia. That is sort of the most important thing about this. Recently classified documents of the Polish Foreign Ministry reveal that during Bronisław Komorowski's visit to Moscow, cooperation was agreed upon between the people of the incumbent Polish president, the Polish secret services, and a member of the Russian gang of murderers. The course of this meeting leaves no doubt that from the very beginning, both the Russian and Polish sides considered cooperation in a matter dealt with by the Kremlin leader a priority. The meeting with Patrushev, a longtime KGB and FSB officer, was attended by General Stanisław Kozioł, as well as, among others, a longtime agent of the Communist Secret Service, a man of the intelligence service during the Third Republic, and one of the main architects of Lech Kaczynski's visit to Katyn, Tomasz Turowski. It refers to the meeting between the head of the National Security Bureau, Stanisław Kozioł, and the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, on May the 8th this year. From our side, Turowski was present. Patrushev, in connection with Victory Day, first mentioned the need to draw a truthful picture of history, saying, "We should have a common interest in objectively reporting on the path to our success, but be clear about its price." He also reiterated his condolences for the Smolensk disaster and concluded with a call to build mutual trust between Poland and the Russian Federation, adding that the Russian side was ready to do so. At Koziew's first meeting with his boss in Moscow, Tomasz Turowski, the ambassador, is also present. Our viewers already know Colonel Rządza. We can say that Turowski is his successor in Moscow. It goes without saying that he also performs intelligence duties there. The meeting is also attended by the then close associate of Stanisław Kozioł, Bartosz Cichocki, and from the side of the Polish mission in Moscow, the interpreter Anna Majdaj. The talks, which began in Moscow on May the 8th, 2010, led to the signing of the agreement on cooperation between the Security Council of the Russian Federation and the National Security Bureau.
A Biurem Bezpieczeństwa Narodowego.
Meetings of the Joint Coordination Group at the level of deputy chiefs, whose main task is to ensure the conditions for dialogue on security issues. Implementation of the national security strategy and military doctrine of the Russian Federation. Review of the defense strategy and national security strategy of the Republic of Poland. Implementation of the reform of the armed forces of Poland and Russia. Patrushev agreed to come to Poland, and on February the 1st, 2011, at the headquarters of the National Security Bureau, solemnly signed such a schedule, an agreement on 2-year cooperation between the two institutions. It can be said that basically 2 documents were signed. The first was a declaration on the establishment of a security dialogue between the BBN and the apparatus of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. And the second document was a plan for cooperation between the BBN and the apparatus of the Security Council of the Russian Federation for 2011-2012. And here it is important what was simply included in this agreement. There was to be a round table of experts to discuss NATO-Russian relations. The cooperation should concern the exchange of views on the military doctrine of the Russian Federation, also on the review of the defense strategy, and the review of security strategy, which are being prepared in Poland, in the BBN, in the Presidential Chancellery, as well as on the reform of the Polish and Russian armies. On December the 6th, 2010, Dmitry Medvedev arrived in Warsaw and began his first official state visit to Poland, here at the Presidential Palace.
Uważam wizytę prezydenta Miedwiediewa w grudniu 2000.
I consider the visit of President Medvedev in December 2010 one of the most important in the whole period of the Polish-Russian reset since 2007.
Jedną z najważniejszych rozmów, rundy dyskusji.
One of the most important talks, rounds of discussions. Not to say the dialogue between Poland and Russia during this whole period of the reset for several reasons. Of course, all the time we have to remember that we are in 2010.
W roku 2010 cały czas i Rosji zależy na tym.
And Russia attaches importance to the fact that Poland does not perceive Russians with Russia negatively during this period and continues to be a sounding board telling the world about Russia, about a democratic Russia, a modernizing Russia, and above all, about a Russia that is not to blame for the crash of the Polish airliner on April the 10th, 2010.
Za katastrofę polskiego samolotu 10 kwietnia 2010 roku.
The talks between the Polish and Russian delegations took place here in the picture hall of the Presidential Palace. The agenda of these talks included basically all the issues that have been on the table in bilateral relations since the beginning of the reset policy, including the issues that were most important to the Russian Federation. This is the first official visit of the President of the Russian Federation to our country in many years. This alone gives the visit the character of a very important visit, and that is how it is perceived by the Polish public. I saw an interview you gave to the Russian media, in which you said that our relations need a bit of commonality, everydayness, normality. I agree with you on that. We are in agreement. Poles and Russians. The visit also included an unannounced concert in the presence of Bronisław Komorowski and Dmitry Medvedev. The artists included Artur Barcis and Maciej Maleńczuk. In addition to the artistic part of the visit, the program also included a festive banquet at the Presidential Palace.
Przyjęcie zakończyło się serdecznymi uściskami.
The reception ended with warm embraces and invitations to further meetings, as well as a Russian call on the horses from Polish President Bronisław Komorowski, who also promised a continuation of the visit in military terms.
Prezydent Rzeczpospolitej Bronisław Komorowski.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni.
24 listopada
On November the 24th, 2010, a few days before the arrival of the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, in Poland, Bronisław Komorowski, President of the Republic, convened a meeting of the National Security Council. He met with former presidents, prime ministers and defense ministers to discuss the long march.
o długim marszu.
Dzień dobry, witam Państwa na konferencji.
Good afternoon, welcome to the press conference of the President of the Republic of Poland. We are preparing well for the arrival of President Medvedev. With this visit, we hope not some one-time breakthrough, but the beginning of a march in the right direction, because at the moment we are beginning this march with increasing intensity.
Ten marsz w tej chwili coraz intensywniejszy.
Dzień po posiedzeniu.
The day after the meeting, the already indicted communist dictator of martial law, Wojciech Jaruzelski, a man who spent years of his professional life in this place, in this office, on this balcony, in the service of Russia and the People's Republic of Poland, wrote a letter to Donald Tusk thanking him for the invitation to participate in such an esteemed group.
List do Donalda Tuska z podziękowaniami za zaproszenie do udziału w tak szacownym gronie.
Russia is a big country, an important factor in the European and world politics. Good neighbourly relations with it are very important. The missile argument mentioned by the Prime Minister, on the other hand, is an example of flexing one's muscles to cure complexes, a somewhat exaggerated reminder of a superpower status. Simultaneously, with the talks in which Poland wanted to strengthen cooperation with the Russian Federation, the Polish General of Staff, as part of an analysis of a possible conflict and attack by Russia on Poland, prepared documents assessing the mutual potential of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the Polish Army. These are the so-called plans for the deployment of forces, also known as pushes for short. From a whole series of recently declassified documents, it appears that the leadership of the Polish armed forces takes the position that the condition of the Polish armed forces in the event of possible aggression on the part of the Russian Federation is so bad that it would be impossible to offer independent resistance for more than 2 weeks. This can be read in this document, which was secret until recently. Considering the quantitative and qualitative superiority of the adversary, especially in missile and artillery forces, aviation and air defence systems, the fulfilment of the Homeland Defence mission by the Polish Armed Forces will be possible in a limited time frame without the support of the alliance due to the absence of a political decision. This amounts to 10 to 14 days.
Jeśli mamy plany obronne na 10 do 14 dni, a wiemy,
If we have defence plans for 10 to 14 days and we know it may take months for Allied forces to arrive, surely that should have consequences in terms of weaponry forces change and how they operate. Only you, sir, are assuming a defence, and it looks like they assumed that the reset would continue. It looks like that they don't want to defend themselves. They are assuming a defence of Poland. And when we read it like that, well, they were satisfied as it is. And they assumed that it would continue like this, that maybe they would invite Lavrov again and pay homage to him, or in another version, maybe the Germans would stand up for them, to Moscow, and everything would be fine, everything would be all right. The published declassified staff documents not only describe the time in which Poland was to defend itself, which is obviously shorter than the time needed by the Allied countries to respond, but also directly indicate the territory on which Poland intended to defend itself. The Polish rulers of that time defined the line on which they wanted to base their defence, the so-called strategic national border. In the event of conducting an independent defensive operation, the armed forces of the Republic of Poland, after an operational deployment in accordance with the applicable operational plan, will proceed to defend the territory of the country in conditions of decisive superiority of the potential enemy, assuming that they will delay his offensive actions and finally stop him at a strictly defined field edge, thus creating the conditions for the arrival and reception of the Allied forces, which, already in a joint Allied operation, will make it possible to expel the potential adversary from the country's territory, thus recovering the territory previously temporarily lost and restoring the country's borders. The concept of defence and establishment of a strategic border with the borders of the Polish state meant that it was assumed that part of the Polish territory would fall into the hands of the Russians, which in practice means giving any part of the territory to the Russian Federation. We have seen this in the ongoing war in Ukraine since 2014. When Ukrainians reconquered the north of the country, the world saw pictures from Bucha. Bucha, Hostomel, Borodyanka, the suburbs of Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, rubble instead of a settlement. This is what the Bishov looks like after the shelling by the Russians. Near Chernigov, a bestial act on the civilian population. My house and dogs burned like a match. We lost everything. In the last 3 days, the Russians have not made much progress on the front, but they continue to commit war crimes and bomb cities and civilian buildings. In the documents of the General Staff prepared during the governments of Donald Tusk and Eva Kopacz, the subsequent defense ministers Bogdan Klich and Tomasz Siemioniak, and during the presidency of Bronisław Komorowski, the strategic direction was very precisely defined. This is evident from these documents, which are being presented to the public for the first time. According to these documents, Poland has a defined strategic border on half of its territory, which was located on the geographical line marked by the course of the Vistula River. This is described, among others, in these two documents. In the event of an attack on Poland, the armed forces of the Republic of Poland will defend its territory, airspace and territorial waters with the aim of delaying the tempo of the enemy's offensive operations as much as possible and stopping the enemy's advance at the extreme course of the Vistula and Dniepr rivers. Another document describes the strategic trench in the lower reaches of the Vistula River in northern Poland. It is defined as follows. In the fifth phase, after the retreat to the strategic section, the main efforts will be directed to stop the enemy's advance and to destroy the bridgeheads on the right bank of the Vistula River in the areas of number 1, Grudziądz, Toruń, Bydgoszcz, and number 2, Otwock, Gowolin, Riki, and also securing the reception of the Allied troops.
Jest to rok 2011 mniej więcej.
If we assume that we are more or less in 2011 and the Polish elite units that have their tasks are liquidated, finally, if we assume that some of these units have irretrievably disappeared, then one could indeed say that one's hair stands on end because of this. Who will defend and guard these outposts of the first frontier and then the next, second line of defense? After all, according to the documents of that time, this strategically very important line should be on the line of the Vistula and Dniepr rivers. I do not believe that there would have been a commander who would have believed in the success of such an operation to stop the enemy. Therefore, I suspect that someone simply planned the deliberate and intentional surrender of this area within a very short period of time. Basically, the whole defense concept is based on giving up half of the territory, hiding behind the river, hoping that in the meantime, Allied help will come. Anyway, that is explicitly written here. Poland, and I would still accept that Poland is not in a position to defend itself if it were not for the fact that these plans look very grim, and if they are combined with the political concept that you mentioned, General, of disarming the Polish army. If you then combine that with the strategic dialogue with the Russian Federation and such an attitude of complete transparency in terms of everything that we have, then you can ask yourself how Poland can be defended at all in this time.
Jak w ogóle Polskę można było w tamtym czasie bronić?
We are in Kadynia, in one of the restaurants where on October the 1st, 2012, the first and not the last, but still important meeting took place between the leadership of the Military Counterintelligence Service and representatives of the Federal Security Service of the FSB who had flown here from Kaliningrad.
Którzy przylecieli tutaj z Kaliningradu, z obwodu kaliningradzkiego. Na czele delegacji rosyjskiej stanął generał.
The Russian delegation was led by General Smolkov. He was accompanied by several FSB officers, but the most important of them is probably the successor of Yuri Grishin.
Pułkownik Władimir Jóźwik.
i.e. the Russian Federation Embassy Counselor in Warsaw, Colonel Vladimir Yushvik, who, as a representative of the FSB, tried to maintain very close relations with all the special services. But he considered the Military Counterintelligence Service, where, by the way, he was a very frequent guest, to be the most important for these relations. But he is one of the organizers, together with the Polish side, General Piotr Pital, of this meeting in this place in Kadynia on October the 1st, 2012.
roku. O charakterze relacji.
The nature of the relationships between the FSB and the RKW is evidenced, among other things, by the fact that at the beginning of this relationship, Russian FSB representatives attempted to learn from the Polish Counterintelligence Service how the Polish services had knowledge of the intelligence activities of GRU representatives working as diplomats in the Russian embassy in Warsaw. The activities of these alleged diplomats, who were in fact officials of the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, GRU, were aggressive and directed against the Polish army to determine its military capabilities.
Odbyło się spotkanie na szczeblu eksperckim z przedstawicielami zarządu.
An expert-level meeting was held in the city of Kadynia with representatives of the FSB's Baltic Fleet Military Counterintelligence Committee and the Kaliningrad region military. We also read that there is no further information about the actual course and scope of the talks. We also read in the documents that the SKW activity report for 2012 only indicates that such a meeting took place.
Od razu uprzedzę.
I will warn you right now, if you want me to read a memo, even if you had access to classified information and you want to read a memo about a meeting that took place here, you will not learn anything about that meeting.
Nie dowiesz.
No, ale myśmy się czegoś...
And we have learned something, and we can show something.
Tak, my dysponujemy.
Yes, we probably have something that many counterintelligence officials in Poland, including military counterintelligence service personnel, have not seen. We have a video recording of this event, which lasted several hours, starting at noon on the 1st of October 2012 and lasting 5 hours. Of course, this recording is only a video recording. We do not have an audio recording.
2012 roku i trwa 5 godzin. Oczywiście ten zapis jest tylko zapisem wideo, nie mamy zapisu fonicznego.
Tu jest komandor Siejek, tu jest...
This is Commander Siek, this is Krzysztof Dusza, this is Pytel, in a characteristic pose with his hands in his pockets, receiving an officer's sabre.
Prezentują i się cofną.
At least to see this material is something very special. You could say something poignant, especially this situation, where the general of the FSB receives a symbol, if you will, of the Polish coat of arms, the Polish army, in the form of an officer's sabre, and kisses it in front of all the celebrants. Once again, in this story, we haven't talked about the Aurora caps yet. We'll come back to it later. Officers of the Polish army, Polish intelligence or counterintelligence, officers of the special services, quite simply, the elite of the elite. They sit down, drink vodka with the Russians for a few hours at a stretch and behave terribly. This is a bit of a misunderstanding. By the time the reset team of high-ranking SKW officers appeared in Baltitsk, correspondence was already underway in the official structures of the military counterintelligence service on the content of the agreement proposed by the Russians between the FSB and SKW. The content of the FSB Treasury Agreement concluded in St. Petersburg on September the 11th, 2011, between General Nosek and Colonel Bezvierchnin, which was still being processed at the time. On the occasion of the signing of this agreement, photos were taken for which the heads of the military counterintelligence service, Piotr Pytel and Janusz Nosek, posed with the caps of Russian soldiers from the cruiser Aurora, the cruiser from which the shots initiated the criminal history of the communist Russia. First of all, we must say that the entire document, including the Polish language, was written by the Russians. We can say with a signature. The main proof of this, although we just know that this was the case, is the specific Polish language of this document. It is the word oboj, meaning both, which is used several times. It's not about an instrument. Yes, exactly. That is whether you wanted to write oba państwa, as in both states. That is, both states have signed the agreement. Article 2, paragraph B, says something like this. The parties shall assist each other in the following main directions of cooperation in the field of military counterintelligence, namely, in countering intelligence and subversive activities of intelligence services of third countries directed against the Russian Federation or the Republic of Poland. Article 8 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that no NATO member may enter into international agreements contrary to the treaty. We are dealing here with exactly what I would qualify and classify as high-at. What are the third countries that conduct intelligence, subversive activities against the Russian Federation? That is, every other country except Poland and the Russian Federation. Even our allies, the NATO allies, or the Russians do not qualify British or American activities exactly as they conduct intelligence and subversive activities against the Russian Federation. Where is the exclusion of our NATO allies here? Where is the point that this agreement does not apply to issues that are governed by the fact of Poland's participation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Faktem uczestnictwa Polski w Pakcie Północnoatlantyckim.
But such a formulated point and such a signed agreement, if taken seriously, explicitly obligates the Polish side to spy jointly with Russia on, for example, the American, British or any other allied service.
Do szpiegowania wspólnie z Rosją, na przykład amerykańskich, na przykład brytyjskich, czy jakichkolwiek innych sojuszniczych służb.
The general principle is that we exchange information with the Russian Federation. If you find out that someone is carrying out activities against the Russian Federation, we must cooperate in this matter and inform the Russian Federation. After April 10, 2010, the Military Counterintelligence Service began to cooperate with the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. Since the beginning of 2011, the service registered the entries of representatives of the Russian Federal Security Service, the successor of the KGB, in the headquarters of the Polish Counterintelligence Service. Colonel Vladimir Yushvik of the Federal Security Service was very often, one could say too often, at the SKW headquarters. We can even count how many times he was here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 75 times a representative of the FSB was there. In which period? From 2001 to 2014. 2011, 2014, 3 years. But look, at December the 30th, 2014, he stayed on the ball until the end. This is already after the war, but on December the 30th, 2014, the war in Ukraine continues. Crimea is occupied. In January 2014, the first cautious note was written in the military counterintelligence that everything they were doing with them was a game of Russian intelligence. But they saw through it and played their game with the Russians as well. And as part of this game, they still invited him to the New Year's Eve. The FSB's official visits to the Military Counterintelligence Service have been recorded in the institution's entry and exit book since January 2011, with meetings even taking place several times a month. They continued throughout 2011 until October the 17th of that year. General Janusz Nosek officially asked Donald Tusk for permission to initiate cooperation. From the moment Donald Tusk gave his handwritten consent until the signing of the agreement, another 2 years passed, as the agreement in St. Petersburg was signed in September 2013. During this time, representatives of the Russian Special Services came to the Military Counterintelligence Service once a week, sometimes more often. After the agreement was signed, meetings dragged on until the end of 2014, with the last meeting taking place on December the 30th of that year. When the policy of dialogue with Russia was implemented in its current form in Poland, Sergei Magnitsky, a lawyer representing a company owned by an American financier, was in a Russian prison. At that time, when the entire Western world was protesting, Sergei Magnitsky, a human rights defender, was in a Moscow prison. The American and Western European public wrote about how inhumanely someone was treated who was simply trying to defend decency in Russia. Sergei Magnitsky worked for Bill Browder, the largest foreign investor in Russia at that time. In November 2005, I was expelled from the country and considered a threat to national security. In 2007, the police raided my offices in Moscow and confiscated all documents. I hired a young lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate. I found out that the seized documents had been used in an elaborate fraud in which a group of corrupt government officials and organized criminals had stolen $230 million from the Russian state, from the taxes we paid. They used our documents to steal their own money. Sergei testified against the users involved. As a result, he was arrested, tortured in prison for 358 days, and then murdered in Russian custody on November the 16th, 2009.
Prowadziliśmy badania w związku z ustawami Magnickiego w polskim archiwum ministerstwa.
We've been researching in the archives of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in connection with the Magnitsky laws and found a very interesting document, your letter, your email to one of the deputies, who was not in the ruling party at that time, but in the opposition, but also not in the government. I wonder if you remember this email. It is an email to Mr. Rachoń and Cenckiewicz. And that is exactly what you are talking about. Have you asked the Polish parliamentarians? Yes, I remember it very well. A copy of a letter Bill Browder sent to Rachoń and Cenckiewicz is preserved in the State Department archives. I hope that you, as chairman of the Committee of Justice and Human Rights in the Sejm, will support an initiative similar to that of Senator Sardin in the Republic of Poland. The 60 officials responsible for Sergei's death can live with impunity in Russia. It is, therefore, up to other countries to help seek justice for Sergei. A visit to Poland is a luxury that should not be granted to those who tortured and killed an innocent man who was simply defending his integrity and beliefs. Do you find any reason why a state could do such a thing? I have no interest in imposing an obvious sanction law imposed by other countries. Poland was a very mysterious case for me, because Poland is the country that I would have thought would have been the most resolute in supporting me on the Magnitsky Act. Poland, as we see now with the invasion of Ukraine, is one of the most solid countries that defended Ukraine.
It really became obvious to me.
But something strange happened in Poland, and that really became clear to me after the crash of the presidential plane, which killed the president and several members of his delegation.
Members of his cabinet died. And that whole
In a normal world, this scenario would lead to war. What I mean is that the president of the country and all his staff travel to Russia and die in a plane crash. There are many theories about this, but I have to believe that it was not an accident. But no one was screaming that it was bloody murder.
Ale ja muszę wierzyć, że to nie był wypadek. Ale nikt nie krzyczał, że to było krwawe morderstwo.
It was all very strange. Why? I mean, why was this case swept under the rug? I don't understand it.
I don't understand that.
From your point of view, can you understand that Poland has not received the wreckage of the plane until today, as we speak? Russia always commits crimes until proven otherwise, and the fact that they withhold evidence shows me one thing very clearly, that they are simply involved. If you look at the website, you will see that 3 shareholders, E.ON, a consortium of BASF, and Gazprom, established an independent company, a project company called Nord Stream, in 2006 after long months of negotiations and preparations. This company is still in operation today. The creation of this company and the laying of the gas pipeline it owned meant that the Russian Federation could pull the energy policy lever and start a series of wars that, regardless of the fact that it was attacking its neighbours and, according to Vladimir Putin's doctrine, rebuilding the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, pumped gas to the West and billions of dollars to Russia through this company. This nondescript office, with which Vladimir Putin could buy tanks, bombs, and everything he needed to attack more countries.
Bomby I wszystko to, co potrzebne było do atakowania kolejnych państw.
Wygląda na to, że spółka normalnie funkcjonuje.
Pomimo nałożenia na Nord Stream sankcji i
Despite the sanctions imposed on Nord Stream and the fact that the money earned by Nord Stream AG goes into the pockets of the criminal regime that is today waging an aggressive war in Europe, the company operates undisturbed and enjoys the security and discretion offered by this small Swiss town. And although the company does not do business and it is impossible to talk about what it spends its money on today, it enjoys discreet care. Our visit quickly triggered an intervention, first by security and the police.
najpierw ochrony oraz policji. A później już ludzi, którzy
And then there were the people who initially pretended to be Swiss or German. But then, when they were forced to switch to their native language, it became clear that they felt most comfortable speaking Russian. And surprisingly, they didn't want to say what their name was or who they worked for.
dla kogo pracują.
But you work for the Russians? Yes, all my life. Do you work for Russian intelligence? What kind of intelligence service? For the Secret Service? For SVR? Are you working for them? I don't work for any intelligence service. What's your name then? What do you do? You film our company. Who do you work for? What are you doing? What do? I do what I'm ordered to do. I think they drove right in front of our cars. Come on, quick, we'll run there. I want to see what they do with our car.
Ja chcę zobaczyć, co robią z naszym samochodem. To jest ten pan?
This is the man? The most important thing is your face. We're not interested in the rest.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym kołem.